the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, and French forces faced one another across no man's land. Here, the armistice decreed
led to the Korean War, and has left it today with rival governments in Pyongyang and Seoul, holding sway over two very different Korean societies. The Soviet Union declared war on the Japanese armies occupying Manchuria and Korea in August that year.
Once again, Korea, the ancient mountain kingdom of Chosen, is in fact the land of the morning calm. But no one forgets June 25th, 1950. It was still dark.
Korea, 1950. Under American leadership, the United Nations went to war for the first time. What began as a conflict
the 38th parallel had finally launched their undeclared all-out war of conquest. Half a world away in Washington, President Truman took immediate action, saying, "In these circumstances, I have ordered United States Air and Sea Forces to give the Korean government troops cover and support." Next day at the United Nations in New York, United States
were joined by
Representative War Holt
300,000 American troops. Although 15 other countries sent military forces, their combined contribution of around 44,000 was dwarfed by the massive American military presence. Opposing them were 135,000 North Korean soldiers. When China entered the war in October 1950, it added 250,000 men to that total, a figure that grew markedly as the war progressed.
One of my young guys got it in the middle. Oh, Jesus,
By
the guy was
28th of
moaning and
June,
groaning.
North T-34
There wasn't much I could do but pat him on the head and say, hang in there.
The North Koreans took the east coast port of Yongdok.
Task Force Smith.
General Walker authorized a withdrawal further south to Pohang. There was no room for further retreat. Some of the Americans had developed a new respect for the North Korean soldiers.
North Koreans are extremely well trained.
It was to be General MacArthur's masterstroke, a landing 150 miles behind the front line at the port for Seoul, seizing the capital itself at the heart of the enemy supply line. The chiefs of staff protested that a landing at Incheon was fraught with problems. The approach through a narrow channel was governed by Wolmido Island. The port itself had high walls and a 30-foot tidal range that at low tide could leave landing craft stranded on mudflats. MacArthur argued that the obvious difficulties would only add to the surprise. Dismissing all objections, he concluded simply, "We shall land at Incheon and I shall crush them." Resistance was remarkably light. Within 2 hours, they'd flushed the few defenders from their bunkers and swept the island. The main force waited at sea for an agonizing 9 hours, coming into land on the next high tide, while the Marines kept the defenders pinned down. Again, there was little opposition, and they quickly established a beachhead. MacArthur's gamble had paid off handsomely, at a cost of only 20 dead. 10 Corps' commander had promised MacArthur he would take Seoul by September the 25th, and he pushed his men on at speed. Belatedly, the North Koreans fought back. They still had 20,000 soldiers around Seoul, and they fought all the way back into the city itself. Then from street to street, and finally from a succession of barricades along the main boulevard.
Commander completes his first assignment under the United Nations banner.
The day after the Incheon landings, the 8th Army began pushing northwards to link up with 10 Corps. It took 3 days of hard fighting to cross the Naktong River. Then the pace quickened as the North Korean line retreat. With South Korea nominally under his control, Syngman Rhee seized the initiative. On the 1st of October, he ordered his own troops across the 38th parallel, in pursuit not only of the northern forces, but of his own dream of a reunited Korea. A week later, the UN forces followed them. Hours after they crossed, a UN resolution ordered that all appropriate steps be taken to ensure conditions of stability. MacArthur again split his forces in two. While the 8th Army drove on due north of Seoul towards Pyongyang, he sent 10 Corps round to effect a landing at Wonsan on the east coast, hoping to repeat the success of Incheon. This time it failed. The front line had already moved north, and 10 Corps followed, driving towards the Chosin Reservoir and the Yalu River, the border with China. On the west coast, the 8th Army took Pyongyang on the 19th of October, the only time the West ever held the communist capital. Syngman Rhee addressed the crowds from the balcony where his opponents had once stood. All Korea, the Chinese came out of the hills again, and this time they weren't going back. The UN had pushed deeper into communist-held territory, and when the Chinese attacked, it was from the flanks and behind, as well as at the head of the columns. The 8th Army in the west was once again taken totally by surprise, and whole sections of the line simply panicked and collapsed. They lost 11,000 men in the first few days. Many were marched off to face the dreadful privations of North Korean and Chinese prison camps. It became known as the Big Bug Out, the worst American military defeat for a century. On the River for 4 days, by which time only 50 men had escaped death or capture. They held an entire army long enough for the Allies to reform and repulse the attack. Ridgway's meat grinder advance and the defeat of the Chinese offensives left the front line near the 38th parallel, and both sides agreed to negotiate, following a Russian initiative. On the 10th of July 1951, a UN team flew to the ancient Korean capital of Kaesong to begin negotiations.